Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 1954. On any given morning, before the sun fully cleared the tree line, the smell hit you first. Not smoke, not yet. Something rawer than that. The sweet, heavy scent of cured tobacco leaf hanging in the air over the west side of the city, like a low-lying weather system that never quite moved on. Then the sound. The deep, mechanical rhythm of the Reynolds plant running full tilt, the kind of industrial noise that after a few years of living nearby, you stopped hearing as noise and started hearing as ordinary life. In 1954, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was producing more than 120 billion cigarettes a year out of Winston-Salem. One factory complex, one city. Output that accounted for roughly a third of all the cigarettes smoked in the United States. The plant didn't just employ the city, in a very real sense. It was the city, the tax base, the neighborhood infrastructure, the rhythm of daily life, from the moment the shift whistle sounded to the moment it sounded again. This is the story of how that happened, how one man's understanding of scale built something that outlasted him by decades, how a single brand came to define not just a company, but an entire American city, and what was left behind when the machines finally stopped. Richard Joshua Reynolds was born in 1850 in Patrick County, Virginia, tobacco country in the most literal sense. His father grew it, his neighbors grew it, and by the time Richard was old enough to observe the economics of it, he understood something most people around him didn't. The people growing tobacco were not the ones getting rich off it. The money was in what came after the harvest. He wasn't an inventor. He wasn't a chemist who discovered a breakthrough compound, or an engineer who redesigned how tobacco was processed. What Reynolds was, with unusual precision for a man of his era, was a systems thinker. He looked at an industry and saw not products but flows of raw material, of labor, of distribution, of consumer habit, and he thought about how to control each stage of that flow before a competitor could. In the 1870s, most tobacco was sold loose, blended inconsistently, priced erratically, and distributed in patterns that made no particular sense. Regional brands dominated regional markets. A product popular in Virginia might be completely unknown in Ohio. Reynolds looked at that fragmentation and saw an industry waiting to be organized, not reinvented, organized. He had no interest in creating a new kind of tobacco. He was interested in making the same tobacco available everywhere, at the same price, to the same standard, at a scale no one had yet attempted. He started small in 1875, renting a factory building in Winston, North Carolina, with a modest operation producing chewing tobacco. Within a decade, he was the dominant plug tobacco producer in the state. He got there not by outspending competitors, but by understanding logistics better than they did, controlling his supply chain, negotiating rail contracts, and reinvesting profit into capacity rather than personal wealth. People who worked with Reynolds in those early years described a man who seemed genuinely uninterested in anything that didn't directly increase output or expand reach. He wasn't building a monument. He was building a machine. What made Reynolds dangerous as a competitor, and this matters for everything that came later, was his patience. He didn't chase trends. He identified structural opportunities and moved into them methodically, one step ahead of the market's own awareness of what it needed. That discipline would define his company long after he was gone. The choice of Winston-Salem as Reynolds's manufacturing base was not sentimental. The man had grown up nearby and knew the region, but regional loyalty played no role in the decision. What played a role was railroad access, raw material proximity, and labor cost. The three variables that determined whether a large industrial operation could be profitable at scale. North Carolina in the late 19th century sat at the center of the American tobacco belt. Near bright leaf tobacco, the specific variety that would eventually go into Camel cigarettes, grew in the sandy red soil of the Piedmont region surrounding Winston-Salem. Processing it within 50 miles of the fields meant Reynolds could control quality at the source, reduce transport costs on the most delicate stage of the supply chain, and respond to crop variations faster than a competitor operating from a distance. The railroad situation was equally important. By the 1880s, Winston-Salem was connected to multiple rail lines running north toward the manufacturing centers of the Northeast and south toward the cotton ports. Finished goods could reach New York in under 2 days. Raw materials could be sourced from across the tobacco-growing South without significant delay. For a company whose entire business model depended on moving consistent product to national markets at competitive prices, this connectivity wasn't a convenience. It was the foundation of the economic model. Labor cost completed the calculation. Wages in the Piedmont South ran significantly below what comparable work would cost in the industrial North. The workforce was large, had some existing familiarity with tobacco as an agricultural product, and was available in sufficient numbers to support rapid expansion. Reynolds didn't build in Winston-Salem because it felt right. He built there because the numbers worked better than anywhere else he'd evaluated. What he couldn't have fully predicted was that the factory's presence would eventually transform the city around it so completely that the two became inseparable. That Winston-Salem would become, in the minds of much of the country, synonymous with the product being made inside his plant. That happened later. In the beginning, it was just a sound location for a tobacco operation. The R.J. Reynolds complex, in its peak years, was not one building. It was a city block, eventually several city blocks, of interconnected structures, each designed for a specific stage of production. Visitors who toured the facility in the 1940s and 50s described the experience as disorienting. The sheer scale of it, the way every element connected to every other element, the sense that the entire operation was a single machine rather than a collection of separate departments. Tobacco arrived by the railcar load. After receiving, it moved into storage buildings where temperature and humidity were carefully controlled, conditions that could make the difference between leaf that processed cleanly and leaf that crumbled. From storage, it went into conditioning, where moisture levels were adjusted to specifications that had been refined over decades. Get this step wrong, and everything downstream suffered. Every supervisor on the processing floor knew the conditioning data before they knew anything else about how the day would go. Cutting followed conditioning. Leaves were reduced to a consistent size, precise enough that the rolling machines downstream could accept them without jamming or producing irregular output. At maximum production, the cutting operations fed material into cigarette-making machines running at speeds measured in thousands of units per minute. Each machine required constant monitoring. A slight variation in tension, temperature, or moisture could produce rejects at a rate that, multiplied across hundreds of machines running simultaneously, represented significant loss. The workers who monitored those machines weren't passive. They were reading the equipment the way a pilot reads instruments, continuously adjusting before problems became failures. Packaging closed the loop. Finished cigarettes were counted, wrapped, boxed, and staged for shipping in a sequence timed to prevent accumulation at any point. The system was designed to flow continuously, not to produce batches. Any bottleneck anywhere on the line backed up the entire operation. The people who managed production scheduling at Reynolds weren't manufacturing experts in the narrow sense. They were, functionally, logistics engineers managing a system where every variable had to stay in balance. What the factory produced at scale wasn't just cigarettes. It was sameness. The industrial guarantee that the Camel you bought in Boston tasted identical to the one you bought in Los Angeles. In 1950, that consistency was still something many consumer industries hadn't fully achieved. Reynolds had built a system specifically to deliver it. In 1913, R.J. Reynolds introduced a cigarette called Camel. Within 2 years, it was the best-selling cigarette in the United States. Within 5, it had reshaped the entire American tobacco market. Understanding how that happened requires understanding what the market looked like before it. In the early 1910s, cigarettes were still competing against pipe tobacco, cigars, and snuff for the American tobacco dollar. The cigarette market itself was fragmented. Dozens of brands, most regional, most defined by the tobacco variety of whatever state they were produced in. Virginia tobacco tasted different from Kentucky tobacco, which tasted different from the bright leaf grown in North Carolina's Piedmont. These regional distinctions created natural market boundaries. A brand built on Virginia leaf dominated Virginia. It didn't necessarily travel. Or Reynolds's insight with Camel was to eliminate regional identity entirely. Camel was a blend, Turkish tobacco mixed with domestic bright leaf and burley, specifically engineered to produce a flavor profile that didn't belong to any particular region and therefore didn't face the ceiling that regional brands hit when they tried to expand. You couldn't say Camel tasted like one place because it didn't. It tasted like itself. That was the point. The marketing campaign that preceded Camel's launch in 1913 was, by the standards of its era, a masterclass in manufactured anticipation. Weeks before the cigarette went on sale in a given city, billboards and newspaper ads appeared carrying nothing but 3 words: Camels are coming. No product description, no brand imagery, just the sentence. Repeated across multiple formats until people were asking each other what it meant. When the cigarettes finally appeared on shelves, there was already a population primed to try them. The packaging was deliberately different from competitors. While other brands used ornate, detailed imagery, Camel's design was clean and memorable. A single dromedary against a desert landscape, easy to recognize across a room or through a shop window. Reynolds understood something about consumer recognition that many of his competitors didn't. Complex images compete with each other. Simple images stick. By 1919, Camel held roughly 40% of the American cigarette market. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. In an industry with dozens of competitors, one brand, introduced 6 years earlier, controlled nearly half the market. The factory in Winston-Salem was running around the clock to keep up with demand. The city's identity was beginning to change around it. By the 1920s, the relationship between R.J. Reynolds and Winston-Salem had moved past employer and location into something closer to mutual identity. The company didn't simply operate in the city. It had become the organizing principle around which the city's economy, infrastructure, and daily rhythms were structured. The employment numbers tell part of the story. At peak production, the Reynolds complex employed more than 10,000 people directly. Factor in the suppliers, the transportation companies, the retail businesses serving the workforce, and the service industries that followed population growth. Then, the company's economic footprint covered a substantial fraction of the city's entire economic activity. When Reynolds did well, Winston-Salem did well. When Reynolds had a difficult year, the effects spread outward through local commerce in ways that were visible within months. Residential neighborhoods had developed in proximity to the plant, in patterns that reflected shift schedules. Streets near the factory filled with housing built during periods of rapid hiring, the architecture changing decade by decade as production expanded and the workforce grew. Schools, churches, and neighborhood businesses organized around the rhythms of a workforce that reported to the same employer in staggered waves across 3 shifts. The factory didn't just employ these neighborhoods, It set the clock they ran on. The city's infrastructure bore the imprint of this relationship. Roads serving the plant were prioritized for maintenance. Rail connections that benefited Reynolds's logistics also served the broader commercial district. Utility expansion tracked factory growth as closely as population growth. These weren't coincidences. They were the natural outcome of a planning environment in which the needs of the dominant employer carried significant weight in civic decisions. The nickname Camel City emerged organically without a marketing campaign or official designation. It came from outside Winston-Salem, from the way the rest of the country had learned to associate the city with the product, the way brand recognition at national scale translated into geographic identity. For residents who had grown up with the factory as part of the landscape, the nickname was a point of pride. For those who would eventually find themselves economically dependent on a single industry's health, it was also a kind of warning that nobody read that way at the time. For the first half of the 20th century, the relationship between tobacco and medicine was, in the most literal sense, promotional. Cigarette advertisements in the 1930s and 40s routinely featured physicians recommending specific brands. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette ran in major publications from 1946 through the early 1950s, accompanied by imagery of medical professionals in white coats. The claim was based on a survey Reynolds had itself commissioned and designed. The industry understood that medical authority, real or manufactured, was the most effective tool available for neutralizing consumer health concerns, which meant the concerns existed and the industry knew it. The scientific record began accumulating in ways the industry could no longer easily contain. In 1950, two studies published in major medical journals, one by Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham in the Journal of the American Medical Association, another by Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill in the British Medical Journal, used statistical analysis to establish a significant relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. These weren't small studies. They were methodologically careful, peer-reviewed, and consistent with each other across the Atlantic. The tobacco industry's response was to fund its own research, cast doubt on methodology, and argue that correlation wasn't causation. That strategy bought time. It did not change the underlying data. In January 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General's Advisory Committee released its report on smoking and health. The conclusion was unambiguous. Cigarette smoking causes lung cancer in men, is a probable cause in women, and is the primary cause of chronic bronchitis. The report received front-page coverage in every major American newspaper. It was the moment the public conversation about tobacco shifted from one involving some doubt to one involving the deliberate management of established fact. I've looked at the internal tobacco industry documents that became public through the 1990s litigation, the memos, the research summaries, the strategy papers. What's striking isn't the deception, which was extensive. What's striking is how early the internal scientific consensus matched the public scientific consensus. Reynolds and its competitors knew what their product did to human health decades before they acknowledged it publicly. The gap between internal knowledge and public position is the defining fact of this period, and it shaped everything that came after. Consumer behavior didn't collapse overnight. Smoking rates in the U.S. peaked in 1965 at roughly 42% of adults, then began a long, uneven decline that would continue for the next half-century. The immediate impact of the 1964 report was real, but not catastrophic for sales. What changed was the context. Tobacco was now a product operating under permanent public scrutiny, and the industry had to learn how to function in that environment. The regulatory escalation that followed the 1964 Surgeon General's report unfolded over decades. each new restriction adding a layer of constraint to an industry that had previously operated with unusual autonomy. Warning labels appeared on cigarette packs in 1965. Broadcast advertising, television, and radio was banned in 1971. Restrictions on where smoking was permitted expanded from federal buildings to airlines to, eventually, most indoor public spaces. Each restriction required operational adjustment. The broadcast advertising ban alone forced Reynolds to completely reconceptualize how it maintained brand visibility, shifting budget toward print, sponsorships, and point-of-sale promotion in ways that kept spending high while moving it to less regulated channels. The company adapted, but adaptation cost money and management attention, and the baseline cost of doing business kept rising while the addressable market kept shrinking. Tobacco taxes became a reliable mechanism for both revenue generation and consumption discouragement. Federal and state excise taxes increased through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, raising retail prices and pushing some price-sensitive consumers toward either reducing consumption or switching to cheaper alternatives. Premium brands like Camel, which had built their position partly on being accessible to ordinary wage earners, faced the structural problem that their customer base was being compressed from both ends, by health-driven quitting decisions from above and by price sensitivity from below. The litigation environment changed the calculus entirely. Individual lawsuits against tobacco companies had largely failed through the 1970s and 80s, with the industry successfully arguing that consumers had assumed risk voluntarily. That argument collapsed in the 1990s when state attorneys general began filing suits to recover Medicaid costs incurred treating smoking-related illnesses, and when internal documents demonstrating the industry's long awareness of its products' dangers became part of the public record. The 1998 Master Settlement Agreement required the major tobacco companies to pay more than $200 billion over 25 years to settling states. It also imposed new restrictions on advertising and required the dissolution of several industry research organizations that had functioned primarily as doubt manufacturing operations. By the end of the 20th century, the tobacco industry remained profitable. The addiction economics that had sustained it since the 19th century didn't simply switch off, but the trajectory had definitively changed. This was no longer a growth business. It was a contraction management exercise, and the factories built for an era of expansion were increasingly misaligned with what a shrinking market required. Large industrial facilities built for mass production carry a particular kind of inertia. They were designed to run continuously at high volume, and their economics only work when they do. The fixed costs, maintenance, utilities, compliance, security, don't scale down proportionally when volume drops. A factory running at 60% capacity pays roughly the same overhead as one running at 100%, with significantly less revenue to cover it. When the market starts contracting, the factory model that worked magnificently in an era of growth becomes a financial anchor in an era of decline. Reynolds had built its Winston-Salem complex for peak American cigarette consumption. The buildings, the infrastructure, the production layout, all of it was engineered for a market that would eventually stop growing and then begin reversing. Adapting that infrastructure to a smaller, different market was neither simple nor cheap. Retrofitting century-old industrial buildings to meet updated environmental standards cost money. Reconfiguring production lines designed for one set of volumes to efficiently handle smaller batches cost money. In many cases, building new, smaller, purpose-designed facilities elsewhere cost less than maintaining and modifying what already existed. A corporate restructuring accelerated the shift. In 1999, R.J.R. Nabisco, the conglomerate that had absorbed Reynolds in 1985 in what was at the time the largest leveraged buyout in American history, spun off its tobacco operations. The new company, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Holdings, carried significant debt from the Nabisco era and faced the additional weight of master settlement agreement payments. The pressure to reduce fixed costs was intense. Production consolidation was the obvious lever. Lines were shut down selectively at first, then in larger groupings as the logic of consolidation took over. Equipment that had run continuously for decades was powered down, disconnected, and removed. Production was shifted to newer, more efficient facilities that could handle the reduced volumes more economically. The Winston-Salem complex, which had once been the center of the company's manufacturing operation, was progressively reduced to a smaller role within a restructured production network. The process was quiet and administrative rather than dramatic. No single announcement, no public ceremony marking the end of an era, just a series of operational decisions, each individually rational, that collectively amounted to the dismantling of something that had taken generations to build. That's how most industrial endings actually happen. Not in a moment, but in an accumulation of adjustments that only add up to a conclusion in retrospect. When production finally ceased at the historic Reynolds complex, the silence was not metaphorical. Buildings that had run 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, they for decades went quiet in a way that people who had lived near them found genuinely disorienting. The background noise of the city changed. Former workers described noticing it at night, lying awake in houses they'd owned for years in a neighborhood that suddenly sounded different. The physical site entered a period that's harder to categorize than either operation or abandonment. Machinery was removed, conveyor systems, manufacturing equipment, the specialized infrastructure of a tobacco processing facility. Utilities were scaled back to maintenance levels. The buildings themselves remained, because buildings of that mass and construction don't disappear easily. Thick brick walls, concrete floors poured to support industrial loads. High ceilings designed to accommodate moving equipment. Demolition would have been enormously expensive and produced an enormous amount of material to dispose of. The city had a large, structurally sound industrial complex on its hands, and no immediate answer for what to do with it. For the workforce, the transition was felt in ways that job placement statistics don't fully capture. People who had worked in those buildings for 20 or 30 years carried knowledge that was specific to those machines, those materials, those processes. That knowledge didn't transfer. The tobacco industry in the United States was contracting across the board. There were no comparable operations expanding elsewhere that might absorb displaced workers. The skills that had made someone valuable inside the Reynolds complex had a limited market outside it. The Winston-Salem confronted a version of the question that post-industrial American cities have faced in various forms since the 1970s. What does a city do with its identity when the industry that created that identity is gone? The answer in Winston-Salem has been, over time, a genuine reinvention. A medical and research economy has developed around Wake Forest University and its affiliated institutions. Arts districts have emerged in repurposed industrial spaces, and the city has worked deliberately to diversify its economic base in ways that the Camel City era made neither necessary nor easy. That process is ongoing. It's also been uneven, and the neighborhoods closest to the former factory have not all shared equally in whatever prosperity the new economy has generated. The Reynolds buildings themselves have been partially redeveloped. Offices, creative space, some commercial use. The industrial past is visible in the architecture in ways that make the history legible to anyone paying attention. That legibility is intentional. There's a recognition that erasing the physical evidence of what the city was would be a kind of dishonesty about how it became what it is. The legacy of the R.J. Reynolds complex is genuinely complicated, and the complication is worth sitting with rather than resolving into a single verdict. On the terms of industrial achievement, what Reynolds built was extraordinary. A man with no inherited wealth and no engineering background built one of the most efficient mass production operations in American history, thus created a brand that achieved 40% market share in a competitive national market within 6 years of launch, and turned a mid-sized southern city into a nationally recognized industrial center. The organizational innovations Reynolds developed in supply chain management, in national distribution strategy, in mass market branding, influenced American consumer industry broadly, well beyond tobacco. You can trace direct lines from Reynolds's approach to Camel, to how packaged goods companies think about national brand building a century later. At the same time, the product. The evidence has been clear for 70 years that cigarettes cause serious disease at a population scale, and the internal documents made public through litigation established that the industry knew this while actively working to prevent public awareness of it. Where there is no version of this history in which that's not a significant moral failure, regardless of the legal and cultural norms of the era in which it occurred. Both things are true simultaneously, the industrial achievement and the harm, and the history doesn't simplify if you try to collapse them into each other. What the Winston-Salem story illustrates most clearly is the structural risk of economic concentration, the same conditions that made the Reynolds complex possible. A single dominant employer organizing the city's labor, infrastructure, and civic identity around itself were the conditions that made the city vulnerable when that employer's trajectory changed. The city's dependence on tobacco wasn't a failure of planning in the usual sense, or it was the rational outcome of having a spectacularly successful industry at the center of the local economy. The vulnerability was built into the success. That pattern has repeated in American industrial history often enough to be recognizable. Steel towns in Pennsylvania, auto towns in Michigan, textile towns across the Carolina Piedmont. The economic logic that makes concentration beneficial during expansion makes the consequences of contraction severe and long-lasting. Winston-Salem's post-tobacco experience, painful, uneven, still ongoing, is a version of a story American manufacturing cities have been living for 50 years. The factory is quieter now. Some of the buildings have new purposes. The city has new industries, but if you know where to look, you can still read the physical history of what was built there and why. And you can still find people whose family's connection to those buildings runs 3 or 4 generations deep. That's not nostalgia. That's what it looks like when an industrial complex genuinely becomes part of a place, when it shapes not just the economy, but the landscape and the memory of a city in ways that outlast the machines themselves.